I'm one of the pastors here. If we haven't met, I'd love to meet you after service. This morning we are continuing our series called Stories Jesus Told. In this series, we've simply been looking at parables, which are simple stories, short stories that use familiar concepts to either illustrate or illuminate some idea or spiritual insight or maybe a truth about how the world works. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, at least the 4 books in the Christian scriptures known as the Gospels, you see in there that Jesus told a lot of parables. It seems to be one of his favorite teaching methods. And these parables are scattered all throughout the 4 books of the Christian scriptures, with some appearing even more than once. And I've never really known what to make of this, because sometimes they appear in different ways. They're not always told the same way. And sometimes the differences are minor. Other times the differences are a little bit more significant. And I think, if I think about this, I think there's a chance that Jesus probably repeated the same story in different settings or different situations and kind of told the story in a little bit of a different way. I think it's also possible because there wasn't pen or paper, and nobody was walking around with iPhones, and so nobody was writing down these stories as Jesus told them. So they were really recorded from memory, and there's a good chance that people remember the story a little bit differently than even after the stories were remembered and retold. They were retold for quite a while before someone actually wrote them down. They have more of an oral tradition. And so there's a good chance that these stories might have evolved a little bit, taken on a little bit of life of their own as they were retold in different contexts to fit the context in which they were told. And so even though these parables, they come to us in kind of fixed and copyrighted versions in our different versions of the Bible, I think in the first century they were probably a little bit more malleable and probably shifted for the context that they were told in. These parables also tend to be a little cryptic. And it makes this challenging sometimes to say with certainty what Jesus meant when he originally told them. In fact, I probably believe that we probably shouldn't say very much at all with any kind of certainty, but that's another point for another day. But in this series, we've kind of been teasing out some of the different ways of understanding these parables, different ways of interpreting them, and even applying them to our life. Because I think the parables invite us into a conversation with how these stories have functioned and continue to function in the lives of people who are dedicated to following Jesus. Now, the parable we're looking at this morning is in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 27. And as far as parables go, this one is fairly popular, but it's also quite simple and easy to understand. That's kind of how parables work. And I'm probably not going to dig, or I am not going to dig too deep into the background on this parable, because actually as I was working on my message this week, Matthew walked into my office and he told me that he had already given a message on this parable before not too long ago. And I checked our YouTube and I saw that, back in September of 2022, Matthew gave a message on this parable. And because I'm sure you all remember everything he said, I don't want to bore you by rehashing old content, and I'm probably going to look at it from a slightly different angle. So let's read this parable so we're all familiar with the story Jesus told in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 27. It reads, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on a rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Now the storyline, like I said, is pretty straightforward here. It draws a contrast between 2 builders, and it's a fictitious story, so I think we're free to use a little bit of our imagination in thinking about the details of this story. And so I imagine that there's 2 builders that probably built similar looking houses. There's a good chance they used the same blueprint. It's a good chance they might have even used the same building materials. even to the details. Maybe they even picked out the same furnishings for their houses. And I think it's safe to assume that these houses were on the same street, or at least in the same neighborhood, because the story tells us that they were hit by the same storm. And according to the story, at least as Jesus tells us, there are no noticeable differences in the visible parts of these two structures, these two houses. The only difference, though, is in the part that is unseen. The difference is in the part that's below the surface. The only difference is likely not noticeable by people walking down the street looking at the house from the outside, at least as far as we can tell from this parable. And again, it's not really a true story, so use your imagination a little bit here. But from the outside, these appear to be similar looking houses. Now, my wife and I, we're looking for a house. We're sort of looking for a house. We're not actively, it's just the two of us. We don't really have to go anywhere. Where we live currently is sufficient. If we came across the right property, really for the right price, because Maryland, right? We might be, or Montgomery County, let me say that, Montgomery County especially. We might be interested in buying a place. Now, sometimes I think we like the idea of looking at houses more than we like the idea of committing to one. And so what this means is we go to a lot of open houses. And of course, the first thing we notice is the neighborhood that a house is in. And then you drive up, you see whether or not it has curb appeal. As we walk in, we pay attention to the layout. We always look to see if the backyard will be good for dogs because we like dogs, and we've been known to have lots of them. But we only really pay attention to the things that are easily seen. Now, of course, we know that some of the most important factors in buying a house are things that are not seen. But these are things often that we know very little about, like the HVAC system. Like, I'm not climbing under the cabinets or going into the basement to make sure the plumbing is good. I know nothing about those kinds of things. The roof, I'm not climbing up on the roof to see if it has any kind of damage when we're just going to visit a house. We're not paying even attention to the foundation of the house because we know nothing about those things. We're just looking at the things that we see that we know something about. Now, personally, I like the idea of a fixer-upper. So if a house needs a little bit of TLC, I'm willing to do it. Like, I'm willing to go for something that needs a little bit of paint, maybe even needs a new roof, maybe some walls taken out even, and the layout of the house rearranged a little bit. My wife, on the other hand, I would say she lacks vision. She would say that she knows that if we bought something that needed a little bit of fixing up, that I would never fix it up. So, and that we'd be living in a fixer-upper for life. She might just be right. But I think that ultimately most of those things that are either repairable or replaceable, like things that we don't like about a house. But if a home inspector tells me that a house has foundation issues, it's a non-starter, right? I'm just not buying. And I have a friend that bought a house with some foundation issues. He's been dealing with them the whole time he's owned the house, and it's probably been 30 years. Maybe not quite that long, maybe 20 years. I'm in church. I want to make sure I'm telling the truth in the story that I'm telling. So maybe about 20 years, he's been dealing with ongoing foundation issues. So for me, it would be a non-starter, right? Because the foundation affects everything. And I think this is what this parable is getting at. Because as the parable goes, the builder built his house, at least the first builder that the story tells us about, built his house on a rock. It's a firm foundation. It's stable. It's not shifting. It's not sinking. It's a good, firm foundation. And we can assume that that builder chose the option of building his house on a firm, stable foundation over other options because Jesus calls him wise, right? You're not wise for making a decision if that's the only decision you can make. So I think the guy had other decisions or other options that he could have chosen. But he chose to build his house on the rock. Look at what it says in verse 24. It says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man or woman, Bible, who built his house on the rock. Now, this builder likely followed the blueprint and didn't cut corners. The other guy, though, might have followed the blueprint, but at some point he chose to ignore that little detail about the foundation. And Jesus calls him foolish. Look at verse 26. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Now, there's no indication about why this guy built on the sand. Maybe he was trying to save some money, or maybe he didn't expect such a powerful storm to hit the neighborhood. He might have just been that guy. We all know him. Some of us might be that person who knows a better way. There's no real reason that's given. And really, his reasoning is not really that important, but the ramifications of that decision are monumental. What we see in this story, in this short parable, is that the foundation, the part that is unseen, the part that's beneath the surface, makes all the difference. Now, whenever I study scriptures, and this is was my process this past week, whenever I study scriptures, I like to compare multiple translations or versions of the Bible. And I tend to start with the NIV. This is a fairly popular, there's no real reason why I start there. It's a fairly popular Bible or version of the Bible. I've used it for a long time. I guess I would say I trust the methodology that was used by the translators. It just kind of feels like a comfortable place for me to start. So not really for any reason. It's just the Bible that I've used for a long time. It's a pretty good translation. So I started there this week, and I read it alongside the New Revised Standard Version, and they just updated that in 2022. And so now it's the NRSV UE for updated edition. I very much dislike the long abbreviation, but if that's the worst thing about it, then I'll live with it. I also read the New American Standard Bible, which is a more literal translation. And because it's is more literal, it kind of takes the words as they were written and tries to put them into English, even if it sounds kind of clunky. The NASB is a little bit difficult to read. Sometimes it doesn't quite make as much sense, kind of wooden and clunky and that kind of thing. But it gives you a sense of how the words would have been structured for the original readers of the text. And so whenever I'm studying a passage, I actually like to go to the NASB and study it along with some others. Now, I feel like I need to say something about the NASB, and I wish I didn't have to say this. It stands for New American Standard Bible, and maybe you've never heard of this before, and maybe the word American in the name of a Bible kind of rubs you the wrong way. Or maybe you never thought about it. That's okay, too. I never really thought about it until this week, but I feel like I need to say that this is not a patriotic Bible. In this world with the resurgence of Christian nationalism and the God Bless the USA Bible that recently a presidential candidate released, I feel like I need to say that the New American Standard Version of the Bible is not that, right? It's a scholarly version of the Bible, and it's American only in the sense that it was published in America. So it's not nationalistic. It's not we are God's chosen. It's not this is a Christian nation kind of Bible. All right, I felt like I needed to say that. Move on. Forget that I said that. If it did matter, I hope you trust and read the NASB. All right, so often when comparing translations or comparing passages in multiple translations, it turns out to be a fruitful exercise. But to be honest, this week I kind of laid them out side by side, and there weren't that many differences between the different versions of the Bible. They almost said the same thing, and I think that's because the story is fairly simple. There are not many differences that there could be. I was a little bit disappointed because I like it when I find, it's almost like a difference. It's like something that's hidden, and I like it when I find something like that, and I can be a little bit curious about it. But to be honest, there weren't a lot of differences. But then I looked at the heading, and y'all know I like the headings, the section headings in the Bible. I tend to really pay attention to those because they usually bother me a little bit. And so then I looked at the section headings between these three translations, and I noticed that the section headings were totally different. Now, these section headings aren't original to the text, right? They were added by translators later as a way of organizing the text and kind of making sense of it and helping us make sense of it. So we could say, hey, look at the parable of the wise and foolish builder. And you can go to that section, and then you could read that parable. Now, in the NIV, the section heading is wise and foolish builders. In the NRSV UE, it's hearers and doers. In the NASB, it's two foundations. And these headings, I think, tell us something about the translator's perspective and perhaps their bias. And maybe that word might rub you the wrong way when it comes to the Bible, but the reality is, and personally, I think it's okay for translators to have a little bit of bias, at least in most cases, because they are human, and it's not really avoidable. I just think we need to be aware that translators, because the Bible wasn't originally written in English, I mean, there were human beings that translated the Bible, and as human beings do, we all have a perspective and a little bit of a bias. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's good to read different versions of the Bible side by side whenever we're studying a passage, because it helps us to see those kinds of things, but it also leads us to a deeper understanding of the text. So I think that that bias is just a natural part, and I also think it's important for us to be aware of our own biases and even preconceived notions that we have whenever we approach a biblical text. Because there's really no such thing as a neutral reading of Scripture. For instance, when I approached this verse, my focus wasn't on whether the builder was wise or foolish. I wasn't thinking about whether there were hearers or doers, but I was focused on the foundation, kind of like the NASB is. By the rock. In fact, I could probably go around this room and ask what you think he's referring to. We might get some different answers. Might we get some that we expect? Might we get some that we wouldn't expect? Some have understood the ideal foundation, the rock that Jesus is referring to be the words of Jesus. And while I think Jesus' words aligned with the way he lived, I would suggest that for us, 2,000 years later, the foundation is not the words of Jesus. In fact, I would suggest that the foundation is Jesus, and that we build our house on Jesus by following in the way of Jesus. Let me say that again. I think for those of us that are reading English translations, or at least modern translations of the Bible, thousands of years after Jesus actually spoke these words, we're not listening to the words as they're coming out of Jesus' mouth, that the foundation is not the words of Jesus, but that the foundation is Jesus, and that we build our house, our life house, if you will, or our life, we build our lives on Jesus by following in the way of Jesus. Now, some have made what I think is a crucial mistake of treating the words of Jesus that are recorded in the Christian scriptures as the foundation. And as a result, we end up with words that are esteemed while the way of Jesus is often ignored and overlooked. I believe this is how we can end up with people who treat the Bible as holy and their neighbor as less than human. And I think this is how we end up with churches that put belief before belonging, because this is what happens when the words of Jesus become the foundation. We end up with Christians who are committed to listening to what Jesus said, but failing to love who Jesus loved. Christians who lack the moral fortitude to follow Jesus when it means loving and embracing and standing up for those who exist on the far margins of our society. You know, when we treat the words of Jesus as the foundation, I just think we're bound to end up with a limited understanding of what it means to follow Jesus, because let's be frank, Jesus did not speak to all the things we're dealing with in our world today. And my concern is that when we hold on so tightly to the words of Jesus as they're written in our English modern translations of the Bible, when we hold on to those words so tightly, we will inevitably let go of the kind of creativity, innovation, and progressive thinking that is needed to live out the way of Jesus in our modern context. When the words become the foundation, what ends up happening is that we bind ourselves to practices and patterns that may have fit the ancient world. and we ignore the timeless way of Jesus in living it out in our world. And these actions, while they may be true to the words that are recorded in our Bibles, will fail to embody a Christ-like ethic because they're built on the ancient words of Jesus instead of his timeless way, and will inevitably end up excluding those who would have been included in the community gathered around Jesus if Jesus was here with us today. Now, I'm not trying to discount the words of Jesus that are recorded in Scripture. In fact, I think they're extraordinarily valuable in our journey of following Jesus. It's just that they aren't the foundation. They're more like signposts that are pointing us to the kind of life Jesus lived and how Jesus would live if he was here with us today. And so I think that this parable is really an invitation for us to wrestle with what it looks like for us to live like Jesus today, to build with Jesus, the way of Jesus, as our foundation. All right, so I think that's how we think, at least that's how I'm thinking about that first foundation. But let's talk about the second foundation that the Bible calls the sand. Now, if we look at this text, and it's only four verses, so it's easy to look at kind of briefly and a little bit side by side. But if we look at these verses, there's a kind of symmetry to this passage. I think people who call this, or who study literature at least, I don't consider myself to be a grammarian, but people who are and really understand literature and the way literature is structured, I think they call this parallelism. At least there's stuff that's parallel, so I'm calling it parallelism. And so Jesus uses this parallelism to draw a contrast between the two builders. And you really notice it if you put these verses side by side. And it's easy to do because it's only 4 verses. So look at these first 2 verses, verse 24, which is paralleled by verse 26. And I'll read a little bit. So this little kind of blue section says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine," and you can look in verse 26, it kind of repeats the same thing, but everyone who hears these words of mine, and then purple, does not, and puts them into practice, is like a man, and then again, and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man. So the one who puts them into practice is like a wise man. The one who does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the rock. And then again, paralleled, who built his house on the sand. Right? So you can kind of see the ideas here between the two are being paralleled with a little bit of a difference between the way they went about it. If you go on to verse 25, that's paralleled with verse 27, it says, "The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house." And then verse 27, "The rain came down, streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house." Identical language used there. "Yet it did not fall," in verse 25. Verse 27, "And it fell with a great crash." And then if we go back to verse 25, it says, "Because it had its foundation on the rock." Now, I hope the colors make this a little bit more obvious, but it seems to me that something is missing from verse 27. To complete the parallelism, verse 27 should read, "Because it had its foundation on the sand." And so to read, "The rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash because it had its foundation on the sand." But those words are not there. This verse does not explicitly state the cause of the crash. And the reader is left to assume that the house came down because it was built on sand. Now, you might be thinking, that's a fairly safe assumption. I had a professor that used to say something about people that made assumptions that I will not say this morning in church. But you might think that's a safe assumption. And I'm not going to argue with you about that. Because it is a safe assumption. I thought the same thing myself. But to be honest, my brain, when I did this chart, my brain would not be satisfied without that little yellow section there at the end of verse 27. I wanted it to say, "Because it had its foundation on the sand." And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to know why that section just wasn't there. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into this, and there's a good chance that I am. I'll just lay that out. So if you're thinking that, I agree with you. There's a good chance that I am, but I've found that when reading the Bible, at least studying it, that following my curiosity has led to some greater understanding and insights about what it means to follow Jesus. So I actually sat in my room for probably longer than I should admit in front of a group of people, staring at the wall, wondering, what does this mean that the yellow section isn't there? I just wanted it to be there, and I could not let go of it. But then I remembered that this parable is told in more than one place, that Luke's gospel also tells this parable, and that I had not gone and read that one. Now, I probably should have read that one and read the two versions of the parable side by side to begin with, but I didn't. But then I went to Luke, when this little yellow section wasn't there, it drove me there. I went to Luke and I read what Luke had to say and the way Luke tells this story. And look at what he says. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid a foundation on rock. When the floods came, the torrent struck, and the house, but the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and the destruction was complete." There it is. You hear that? That guy built a house on the ground without a foundation. So there's a house with a foundation, and then there's a house with no foundation at all. And Luke's version of this parable makes me wonder, is that why Jesus stopped short of completing the parallelism? Is that why that little yellow section wasn't there that stated the cause of the crash and saying because it had its foundation on the sand? Maybe Jesus or Matthew knew that there wasn't a foundation at all. Which led me to think, what does it mean to live a foundationless life? And what is Jesus getting at here by talking about this one house and using it as a metaphor for our lives, our life house, if you will, that's built on a rock, a firm foundation, and another one that's built with no foundation at all? Now, it probably comes as no surprise to you that this parable in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 is often used as a metaphor for Judgment Day. And as this reading of the parable goes, our lives will face the ultimate test one day, a storm, the storm of judgment. And the house built on the rock represents those who've heard the teachings of Jesus and lived according to them. And this house will stand through the storm of judgment. On the other hand, there's a house that's built on sand that represents the one who heard Jesus' teachings but have not acted on them. And their lives, therefore, lack a solid foundation and will collapse under the weight of judgment. And while I think I see how someone can arrive at this conclusion and this way of understanding this parable, not only is it deeply dissatisfying to me, but I think it also overlooks the repeated emphasis that Jesus places on the matters of the heart, the inner stuff of our lives. You see, Jesus seems to have no interest in dogma or legalism or getting his followers to fall in line because they fear some impending judgment day. Jesus seems more interested in a transformed life where our actions begin to look different because something's happened on the inside. And I think that means that we got to do some inner work to build our lives on Jesus and build our lives with Jesus as our foundation. As Luke's version of the parable says, we got to dig down deep. We got to go inward. Because it's only as we work on the unseen part, on the part below the surface of our lives, that we can build our house, our life house, on the firm foundation that is Jesus. Now, sure, without this kind of inner work, we can follow the rules. We can be good people. We can do good work. We can make a difference in the world. We can leave a lasting legacy. We can accomplish great things. We can pursue peace and justice. We can build a house. We can build our lives into an impressive structure. We can do all kinds of good things without having our lives founded on Jesus. But I don't think good works alone are what Jesus is after here in this parable. Now, I got to wrap up this message in just a minute, but I want you to look at one more thing that I haven't spoken about much this morning, which is the context of this parable. If you're familiar with Matthew chapter 7, you know that it's the end of what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount spans Matthew 5, chapter 5, 6, and 7. It's the longest continuous teaching of Jesus recorded in the scriptures. And this message that Jesus gave on the side of a mountain or a big hill is arguably Jesus' most popular teaching. And it contains some of the more memorable passage or more memorable things that Jesus said. It includes some of the Bible's more challenging ethical teachings with radical ideas like making peace, loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute us, stuff like that, stuff that makes us uncomfortable. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus urges his followers to embrace God's way of love, a path that will ultimately bring about the renewal of all creation, which he describes this renewed world as God's kingdom where heaven and earth are unified. And while some tried to reduce the teachings of Jesus to mere good works or just another law or just more rules for us to follow, Jesus is constantly emphasizing that good works, at least for his followers, come from a transformed heart. And so in this parable in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 27, which it makes up, or this parable that comes in Matthew chapter 24, verse, this parable that comes in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 27, makes up the last 4 verses of the Sermon on the Mount. And so I think when Jesus says in this parable, these words, when he says, everyone who hears these words of mine, I think he's not thinking about these words that tell you what to do. I think he's talking about the way those actions come about, which is through a transformed heart. He's not saying whoever hears the law and follows it to a T is the one who built his house on the rock. He's saying that the one who hears the way God transforms the life of the one making a decision to follow Jesus is the one who builds his house on the rock. Remember, in verse 24, it says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock, who hears these words. Those are these words I'm talking about. In verse 26, he does the same thing. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. You see, these words does not refer to the whole corpus of Jesus' teaching. Rather, these words, I think, has to do with the way Jesus transforms a life. He starts with the heart, the inner stuff, the part that is unseen, the part that's beneath the surface. And it's from a transformed heart that come actions that align with the will of God. In other words, pursuing good work without God can easily lead us to build our house, our life house, on our own ideas of righteousness, rather than God's vision of a renewed creation. And this kind of self-righteousness is dangerous because it shifts the focus from God's love and God's vision of a restored creation to human effort and achievement and our all too often flawed idea of what a healed and whole world looks like. You see, this kind of self-righteousness does not build the kind of community that God envisions, but rather an isolated, individualistic, commitment to following the rules. And that's not what Jesus is after. And we constantly see Jesus, at least in the Gospels, we see Jesus rebuking the Pharisees for this kind of righteousness, because they were known for their strict adherence to the law, but they missed the heart of the law, which is love for God and love for neighbor. They were self-righteous, relying on their own ability to do good, while ultimately building a foundationless life that failed to please God. And that brings me back to this parable. I don't think Jesus is saying that the builder who built on the sand failed to do good work. That builder built a house, and it was similar to the one who built on the rock. Built a nice house, one that my wife and I would have walked in and said, we can live here. But he failed to do good work with God towards God's vision of heaven on earth. I want to close with a quote from theologian Howard Thurman, because I think what he says here is relevant. He says, the movement of the Spirit of God in the hearts of men and women often cause them to act against the spirit of our times or their times, and causes them to anticipate a spirit which is yet in the making. The reality is, it's difficult for us on our own, through our own ideas of what God would do, what God might want to do, how God might work in this world. It's difficult for us on our own to discern what it looks like to do good in this world. And it's only with God, by the leading of God's Spirit, that we can do what God wills and how God wants to renew this place. The band can come back up. Let me read this parable one more time as we prepare ourselves for communion. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. You know, this morning and every Sunday, we always have a time of reflection and response where we share in communion, and that's what's prepared at the table in the center and these two tables on the side. In the flyer that you received when you came in, there's some other ways that some people like to respond and spend this moment in reflection. Feel free to check that out. And I think it's always good to just sit and do nothing and be mindful of God's presence with you right now and always. But whatever you feel led to do in this moment, feel free to respond to God however feels appropriate to you. Let's spend a moment in prayer. God, we're grateful for the record we have received of these stories you told. We're thankful that we can read it and not read it just within our community, but fully aware that we're reading it alongside other communities that are dedicated to following you. We're grateful that as we understand it, or as we seek to understand it and apply our limited understanding of it to our lives, I believe we can do so with full confidence that when we strive to that end, we contribute in making the world a better place. And so as we reflect, as we respond, we pray that you will help us build our lives on Jesus and live our lives in a way that follows in the way of Jesus, with the hope that in doing so, we will, in a very selfless way, in a way that's not self-righteous, it's not proud of our good works, but a way that is hopeful that when we do good work, we're contributing to, we're participating in your work of renewing this place. We give you thanks. Amen.